Captain Zareth clicked her mandibles in disbelief as she read the message from the human colony ship, Wanderer. The translation matrix had to be malfunctioning. No species in the known galaxy would send such an invitation. They want us to what? First Officer Crixtall leaned over her shoulder, his scaled head tilting in confusion. According to this, the humans are inviting us to join them for something they call Thanksgiving dinner. They specifically requested the presence of what they term apex predators from the galactic community. Zareth's voice carried the bewilderment she felt. The bridge of the Veltar hunting vessel, Bloodfang, fell silent. For 3 cycles, they had been tracking the human colony ship through the Outer Rim territories. Not to attack, the Galactic Council had made first contact with humans only 6 months ago, and they were still considered a protected developing species. But the Veltar were curious about these newcomers who had appeared seemingly from nowhere with technology that shouldn't exist. Humans were strange. Everyone in the galaxy agreed on that point. They had somehow developed faster-than-light travel without understanding the basic principles of energy manipulation that every other species had mastered first. Their ships were crude metal constructs held together with what could only be described as controlled explosions, yet they moved faster than vessels built by civilizations thousands of years older. "Sir," Communications Officer Hexra spoke up from her station, "we're receiving similar messages from other ships in the sector. The Krillian Death Dealers, the Thoraxian Swarm Hunters, even the Nethys Shadow Stalkers, all being invited to this feast." Zareth's primary eyes narrowed while her secondary eyes focused on the tactical display. 17 of the most dangerous predator species in the local cluster were within response range of the human ship. Species that normally avoided each other except in neutral ports, species whose very presence together would typically result in bloodshed. "They're either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid," muttered weapons specialist Gorth Ak, his massive frame hunched over his console. "With humans, those tend to be the same thing," Zareth replied. She had studied the limited files available on the species. Their history was a tapestry of impossible victories against overwhelming odds, achieved through tactics that ranged from brilliant to completely insane. The message contained coordinates for a meeting point in a neutral asteroid field, along with detailed instructions about weapon restrictions and behavioral expectations. What caught Zareth's attention most was a single line buried in the technical specifications. "Come hungry, leave as friends." "Captain, what are your orders?" Crixtall asked. Zareth considered her options. The Veltar were apex predators themselves, having evolved from pack hunters on a world where everything tried to kill everything else. They had earned their place among the stars through strength and cunning. They feared nothing in the known galaxy. So why did the thought of sharing a meal with humans make her hunting instincts scream warnings? "Set course for the coordinates," she decided. "If nothing else, we'll learn more about these humans. And if they prove hostile," she gestured to the weapon displays, "we'll remind them why the galaxy fears the Veltar." The Bloodfang changed course, its dark hull cutting through space toward the designated meeting point. Around them, other ships did the same. Sleek Krillian blade ships that moved like liquid mercury. Massive Thoraxian hive vessels bristling with bioweapons. Shadow-cloaked Nethys raiders that appeared and disappeared like nightmares, all converging on a single human colony ship. As they approached the asteroid field, Zareth's tactical officer began reading sensor reports. "Captain, I'm detecting the human vessel. It's unusual." The main screen flickered to life, showing the human ship in all its impossible glory. Where other species built elegant curves or imposing spear points, humans had apparently decided to strap engines to what looked like a flying city. The Wanderer was a massive, ungainly construction of metal and ceramic, bristling with communication arrays and solar collectors. It looked like it had been built by committee, expanded randomly, and held together through sheer determination. "How does that thing even fly?" someone whispered. "More importantly," Zarath said, "how does it house 40,000 humans?" The numbers were staggering. Most colony ships carried a few hundred individuals at most. The humans had somehow managed to cram an entire civilization into their vessel, complete with manufacturing facilities, agricultural domes, and what appeared to be recreational areas. "Incoming transmission," Hexra announced. The screen changed to show a human face. Zarath had seen humans before in the first contact recordings, but seeing one address her directly was still jarring. They looked so fragile, with their soft skin and small teeth. No natural weapons, no armor plating, no obvious adaptations for survival. Yet somehow, this species had not only survived, but thrived enough to build ships that dwarfed most military vessels. "Greetings, friends," the human said, its voice warm and welcoming. "I'm Captain Sarah Chen of the colony ship Wanderer. Thank you all for accepting our invitation. I know this might seem unusual, but we have a tradition among our people. When we establish a new home, we celebrate by sharing a feast with our neighbors. We call it Thanksgiving." Zarath activated her translator and responded, "I am Captain Zarath of the Veltar vessel, Bloodfang. Your invitation was unexpected. What exactly do you propose?" The human smiled, an expression that showed its small, flat teeth. Among most species, displaying teeth was a threat. Humans somehow made it seem friendly. "We propose exactly what we said. A feast. We've prepared food representing our various cultures, and we'd like to share it with you. In return, we hope to learn about your peoples and perhaps start some friendships." "You want to feed us?" This came from one of the other ships, the guttural voice of a Krillian captain. "That's right," Sarah Chen confirmed. "We know that bringing together so many predator species might seem dangerous to some, but we believe that sharing a meal is the first step toward understanding each other." The communication channel buzzed with overlapping conversations as the various captains conferred with their crews. Zarath muted her transmission and turned to her officers. "Thoughts?" "It's obviously a trap," Gorthak growled. "No species invites predators to dinner unless they plan to make them the main course." "But what kind of trap?" Krixtal wondered aloud. "They're outnumbered 17 to 1. Even if their ship has hidden weapons, they can't hope to defeat all of us." "Maybe that's the point," suggested Hexra. "Maybe they don't plan to defeat us. Maybe they plan to recruit us." Zarath considered this. Humans were known for their adaptability and their tendency to turn enemies into allies. Their own history was full of former adversaries who had become trusted partners. Could they be planning to do the same with the galaxy's predators? "There's only one way to find out," she decided, reactivating the communication link. "Captain Chen, the Veltar accept your invitation. However, we will arrive armed and ready for treachery." The human woman's smile never wavered. "We wouldn't expect anything less. But I think you'll find that the only thing you need to worry about is whether you brought stretchy pants." The channel closed, leaving Zarath to puzzle over the meaning of that last statement. Human idioms were notoriously difficult to translate. Over the next few hours, the various predator fleets arranged themselves around the human vessel in a complex dance of mutual suspicion and curiosity. Each ship maintained weapons distance from the others, while also positioning themselves for quick escape if needed. It was the most tense parking arrangement in galactic history. The Wanderer seemed completely unconcerned by the floating arsenal surrounding it. Instead, it extended docking tubes toward the nearest ships and began broadcasting detailed instructions for atmospheric compatibility and gravity adjustment. They had somehow prepared for the environmental needs of 17 different species, including several that had never before shared the same space. "Captain," Krixtal reported, "they're requesting that we limit our boarding parties to 10 individuals each. They say it's for space management, not security." Zarath selected her most trusted warriors and prepared to board the human vessel. As she sealed her armor and checked her weapons one final time, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something unprecedented. The docking bay of the Wanderer was larger than expected, easily accommodating multiple shuttles from different species. What struck Zarath immediately was the smell. Instead of the sterile, recycled air of most ships, this place smelled of something warm and inviting, something that made her hunting instincts relax despite her better judgment. Humans greeted each boarding party personally, offering what they called welcome drinks and small appetizers. They seemed genuinely excited to meet each species, asking questions about their cultures and sharing information about their own. It was unlike any first contact scenario Zarath had ever heard of. A young human male approached her group, showing no fear despite being surrounded by armed Veltar warriors. "Captain Zarath, I'm Lieutenant Rodriguez. Captain Chen asked me to give you and your people a tour before the main event begins." "Main event?" Zarath's translator converted her clicking speech into the human language. "The feast, of course, but we thought you might want to see how we prepare food for 40,000 people. It's quite a sight." Against her better judgment, Zarath found herself following the human through corridors filled with the sounds of celebration. Children ran past them, laughing and playing games. Elderly humans sat in groups, telling stories to anyone who would listen. Artists painted murals on the walls, while musicians filled the air with complex harmonies. "Your ship is a flying city," she observed. "That's exactly what it is," Rodriguez confirmed. "When we left Earth, we brought everything we needed to start a new civilization. Our families, our cultures, our traditions. We even brought our recipes." They entered a massive chamber filled with cooking stations. Hundreds of humans worked together, preparing dishes that filled the air with smells Zarath had never experienced. Steam rose from enormous pots, while ovens radiated heat that could be felt across the room. It was organized chaos on a scale that shouldn't have been possible. "This is just one of our kitchens," Rodriguez explained proudly. "We have 12 more just like it. Today, we're preparing traditional dishes from every human culture we have represented on the ship. Chinese dumplings, Mexican tamales, Indian curries, Italian pastas, Ethiopian injera, Japanese sushi, German sausages, Russian borscht. The list goes on and on." Zarath stared at the operation in amazement. The logistical complexity was staggering. "How many different foods are you preparing?" "Last count was over 300 dishes," Rodriguez said casually, "plus variations to accommodate different dietary needs. We know some of your species are carnivores, others are omnivores, and a few are energy feeders. We've tried to prepare something for everyone." A thought struck Zarath. "How did you know what we could eat safely?" Rodriguez grinned. "We asked. We've been monitoring your communication frequencies and sent dietary questions to your medical departments. Most species were happy to help once they realized we were trying to avoid poisoning anyone. They had done research. They had planned this. They had somehow convinced the medical departments of 17 different species to cooperate with what should have appeared to be an insane request. The more Zarath learned about this feast, the more impossible it seemed. "Lieutenant," she said carefully, "why are you doing this?" The young human stopped walking and turned to face her directly. For a moment, his casual friendliness gave way to something more serious. "Because that's what humans do, Captain. We make friends. We build communities. We turn strangers into family." He paused, looking around at the controlled chaos of the kitchen. "Our history is full of conflict, but our greatest achievements have always come when we worked together. When we shared what we had with others." "Even with predators?" Zarath asked. "Even with species that could kill you without effort?" Rodriguez smiled again, and this time Zarath understood why humans showed their teeth when they were happy. It wasn't a threat display, it was an invitation. "Especially with predators, Captain. Because if you can turn a predator into a friend, you've just gained the most loyal ally in the galaxy. Before Zarath could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the ship. Not emergency alarms, but something more celebratory. The tour group was joined by streams of humans moving toward what Rodriguez called the Great Hall. "Is it time?" Zarath asked. "It's time," Rodriguez confirmed. "Welcome to your first human Thanksgiving, Captain. Try not to eat so much that you can't move afterward." As they joined the flow of beings heading toward the feast, Zarath realized that everything she thought she knew about human tactics was wrong. They weren't trying to conquer through force or cunning. They were trying to conquer through kindness. It was the most terrifying strategy she had ever encountered. The Great Hall was exactly what its name implied, a cavernous space that stretched for hundreds of meters in every direction. Tables had been arranged to accommodate the different sizes and shapes of the attending species, with careful attention paid to ensuring that natural enemies weren't seated too close to each other. But what dominated the space wasn't the seating arrangement or even the incredible variety of species present. It was the food. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes from across human civilization. The smells were overwhelming, spices and herbs that had never before existed in the same space, cooking techniques that represented thousands of years of culinary evolution, flavors that spoke of home and tradition and love. And in the center of it all, Captain Sarah Chen stood with her arms spread wide, welcoming everyone to the most impossible feast in galactic history. "Friends," she said, her voice carrying across the hall without technological assistance. "Thank you for joining us. Today we share not just food, but the beginning of a new chapter in galactic history. Today we prove that the strongest bonds are forged not in battle, but around the dinner table." Zarath took her seat, her warriors flanking her, and stared at the abundance before them. For the first time in her military career, she wasn't sure if she was looking at humanity's greatest strength or their most dangerous weapon. Perhaps, she realized, they were the same thing. The feast began with what humans called a moment of gratitude. Captain Chen asked everyone to observe 30 seconds of silence to reflect on what they were thankful for. Zarath used the time to scan the room, noting escape routes and potential weapons. Old habits died hard. When the silence ended, the humans erupted into activity. They moved between tables like a coordinated swarm, serving food and explaining dishes with infectious enthusiasm. What struck Zarath immediately was that they served the predators first, not out of fear, but out of what they called hospitality. "This is turkey," a human grandmother explained to Gorthok as she placed a massive platter before him. "It's a traditional bird we prepare for this holiday. The spices are sage, thyme, and rosemary. Try it with this cranberry sauce. It adds sweetness to balance the savory flavors." Gorthak, who could crush the elderly human without effort, accepted the plate with surprising gentleness. "You are not afraid of me, small one?" The grandmother laughed, a sound like musical wind chimes. "Afraid? Honey, I raised 7 children and buried 1 husband. You're scary, but you've got nothing on a toddler with a crayon and white walls." Other conversations were happening around the hall, as humans engaged with beings that most species considered nightmares. A human child was showing a Thoraxian warrior how to fold napkins into shapes. A teenage human was teaching a group of Nethys shadow stalkers a card game that involved lying about the contents of your hand. "This is remarkable," Krixtal whispered to Zarath. "They show no fear at all. They're either the bravest species in the galaxy or the most naive," she replied, watching a human toddler toddle directly toward a Krillian death dealer who could vaporize the child with a thought. The Krillian, whose species had perfected warfare to an art form, carefully moved aside so the toddler wouldn't bump into its crystalline legs. When the child offered it a piece of bread, the massive warrior accepted it with the same solemnity it would show to a military honor. Perhaps, Krixtal suggested, those are the same thing. The food kept coming. Dishes that represented thousands of years of human culinary evolution. Each one explained with stories about the culture that created it. The humans didn't just serve food, they shared history, tradition, and meaning with every plate. A young human woman approached Zarath with something she called pad thai. "This is from Thailand, back on Earth," she explained. "My grandmother taught me to make it before she died. The rice noodles represent long life, and the tamarind gives it that sweet-sour balance that's supposed to remind you that life has both good and difficult moments." Zarath tasted it carefully. Her species had evolved to detect toxins, but this food triggered no warnings. Instead, it triggered something else, a complex cascade of flavors that somehow did tell a story of balance between sweetness and sourness, of traditions passed down through generations, of love expressed through careful preparation. "It's educational," she said finally, not sure how else to describe food that carried emotional weight. "That's the point," the young woman smiled. "Food isn't just fuel for humans, it's how we share our cultures, our histories, our love. Every dish tells a story about who we are." Around the hall, similar exchanges were happening. Humans weren't just feeding their guests, they were sharing pieces of their souls, and somehow the predators were responding. Captain Vextar of the Nethys Shadow Stalkers, whose species communicated primarily through intimidation, found himself in conversation with a human chef about something called molecular gastronomy. The chef was explaining how they used liquid nitrogen to create foods that changed texture and temperature as you ate them. "You alter the physical properties of nutrition for aesthetic purposes?" Vextar asked, his mental voice tinged with fascination. "We do it because it's beautiful," the chef replied, "and because it surprises people. There's joy in discovering that something can be more than you expected it to be." Vexitar, who spent his existence lurking in shadows and inspiring terror, found this concept oddly compelling. Beauty for its own sake. Joy through surprise. His species had words for these concepts, but they were ancient words, forgotten in countless cycles of warfare. At another table, a Thoraxian hive commander was learning about something humans called comfort food from a group of human soldiers. The commander, whose species existed in a state of constant warfare, struggled to understand food that existed purely to make people feel better. "You prepare nutrition specifically to improve emotional states?" It buzzed in confusion. "Absolutely," one of the soldiers replied, spooning what he called mac and cheese onto a plate designed for the Thoraxian's complex mouth structure. "This isn't the most nutritious thing we make, but when you're homesick or sad or just having a rough day, this makes everything a little better." The hive commander tasted it carefully. The combination of pasta and cheese was simple by human standards, but for a being whose food was typically processed nutrition paste, the richness was overwhelming. More than that, something about it triggered what could only be described as contentment. "Your species weaponizes comfort," the commander observed. The soldier laughed. "We prefer to think of it as healing through eating." But the most remarkable transformation was happening at the main table, where Captain Chen had seated herself between the leaders of the most dangerous species present. Instead of the tense standoff everyone had expected, conversation was flowing like wine. "Let me understand this," rumbled Commander Zethkri of the Krillian Death Dealers. "You maintain cultural diversity even within your single species?" "Thousands of different cultures," Chen confirmed, passing him something called kimchi. "Different languages, different traditions, different ways of preparing food. This is from Korea. Fermented vegetables with spices. It's supposed to aid digestion and boost immune function." Zethkri, whose species had achieved unity through the elimination of all but one culture, sampled the kimchi with curiosity. The complex fermentation created layers of flavor that evolved as he chewed. And these cultures coexist? Without warfare? Not without conflict, Chen admitted. We've had our share of wars and disagreements, but we've learned that our differences make us stronger, not weaker. Different cultures see different solutions to problems. Different cuisines provide different nutritional benefits. Diversity is a survival strategy. Fascinating, clicked High Predator Rathix of the Veltar pack. My species maintains clan differences, but we consider them weaknesses to be overcome. We used to think that too, Chen replied, serving him something called jambalaya. This dish comes from Louisiana, where 3 different cultures, French, Spanish, and African, were forced together by circumstance. Instead of one culture dominating the others, they blended their cooking techniques and created something entirely new, something better than any of them could have made alone. The conversation continued as the meal progressed through multiple courses. Humans seemed to have an infinite variety of foods, each with its own story, its own cultural significance, its own reason for existing. They had spent centuries developing not just ways to feed themselves, but ways to celebrate, to comfort, to share joy through food. What began to emerge as the evening wore on was a picture of humanity that no one had expected. Here was a species that had turned survival into an art form, that had transformed eating into a method of communication, that had somehow convinced 17 different kinds of apex predator to sit peacefully around tables and share stories. "I have a question," announced war leader Thaxmore of the Thoraxian swarm, his voice cutting through the general conversation. The hall fell silent, predator instincts still sharp despite the convivial atmosphere. "Ask away," Chen replied calmly. "Your species is new to the galaxy. You have no military alliances, no established trade relationships, no protection from the various empires and confederations that dominate this region of space. Yet you broadcast your location freely and invite dangerous beings onto your ship. This seems unwise." Chen smiled, and for the first time Zarath noticed that the expression carried more than warmth. There was steel beneath the hospitality, confidence beneath the friendship. "War leader, let me tell you something about human military doctrine. For most of our history, we fought each other. We developed thousands of different ways to kill, to conquer, to destroy. We got very good at warfare." She stood, moving to a display screen that showed images of human conflicts throughout their history. Battles that made galactic warfare look like children's games. Weapons that could destroy entire worlds. Strategies that turned weaknesses into strengths and defeats into victories. But we also learned something else. The strongest armies aren't built on fear. They're built on loyalty. The most secure nations aren't the ones with the biggest weapons. They're the ones with the most friends. The longest-lasting empires aren't conquered territories. They're voluntary alliances. She gestured around the hall, where predators were sharing food and stories with humans and each other. "So when we entered your galaxy, we had a choice. We could try to conquer through force, fight our way to a place among the stars. Or we could do what humans do best. We could make friends." Thaxmore's compound eyes glittered with something that might have been respect. "And if we refuse your friendship? If we choose to see you as prey rather than allies?" The temperature in the hall seemed to drop several degrees. Every human in sight stopped what they were doing and looked at Chen, waiting for her response. For the first time since the feast began, the predators were reminded that they were surrounded by 40,000 humans who had just demonstrated the kind of logistical coordination that won wars. Chen's smile never wavered, but her voice carried new weight. "War leader, we've prepared food for 17 different species without poisoning anyone. We've managed the environmental needs of beings who shouldn't be able to exist in the same space. We've coordinated the efforts of thousands of individuals to create a single, seamless experience." She paused, letting the implications sink in. If we can do all this to welcome you as friends, imagine what we could do to defend ourselves from enemies. The hall remained silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, Thaxamore began to buzz, the Thoraxian equivalent of laughter. "Point taken, Captain Chen. Point very well taken." The tension broke, and conversation resumed, but something had changed. The predators now understood that human hospitality wasn't weakness. It was strength expressed in an unfamiliar form. They were being welcomed not by prey animals, but by a species that had chosen friendship over warfare as their primary strategy for survival. As the main courses gave way to something humans called dessert, Zarath found herself in conversation with a human child who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. The child was explaining the concept of birthday cake with the kind of enthusiasm that only the young could muster. "So once a year, we make special food just to celebrate that you were born?" Zarath asked, trying to understand. "Exactly," the child exclaimed. "And we put candles on it that represent how many years you've been alive, and then you make a wish and blow them out, and everyone sings to you. Your species celebrates individual existence annually." "Of course, birthdays are important. They remind us that we're glad you exist." Zarath, who had spent her adult life as a professional killer, found herself unexpectedly moved by the concept. A species that celebrated existence itself, that created special food just to mark the passage of another year of life. That took time to remind each individual that their existence mattered. "Do you have a birthday, Captain Zarath?" the child asked. Yes. All living beings have a day they were born." "Then next year we should make you a birthday cake. What's your favorite flavor?" Before Zarath could explain that her species didn't really have the concept of favorite flavors, she found herself thinking about the tastes she had experienced during the evening. The complexity of the pad thai, the richness of the mac and cheese, the surprising tartness of the cranberry sauce. "I think," she said slowly, "I might like to try chocolate." The child's face lit up as if Zarath had given her a gift. "Chocolate birthday cake is the best. I'll tell my mom to write it down so we remember." As the evening wound down and the various species prepared to return to their ships, something unprecedented was happening. Contact information was being exchanged. Trade agreements were being discussed informally. Several species that had been enemies for generations were talking about neutral meetings to discuss territorial disputes. The Krillian death dealers were sharing their crystal-growing techniques with human engineers. The Thoraxian hive mind was discussing agricultural methods with human farmers. The Nethys shadow stalkers were examining human stealth technology with professional interest. Captain Chen found Zarath as the Veltar delegation prepared to leave. "Captain, before you go, I wanted to give you something." She handed Zarath a small container. "Leftovers. It's another human tradition. You never let guests leave empty-handed." Zarath accepted the container, which was warm and smelled of the spices she had encountered during the meal. "Captain Chen, I must ask, was this all planned? The conversations, the cultural exchanges, the way everyone began cooperating?" Chen smiled. "Captain, the only thing we planned was the menu. Everything else? That's just what happens when you feed people good food and treat them like family." "Family? That's what you are now, Zarath. All of you. You accepted our invitation. You shared our table. You broke bread with us. In human culture, that makes you family. And we protect our family." As Zarath returned to her ship, she carried with her more than just leftovers. She carried the memory of a species that had somehow convinced 17 different kinds of predator to sit peacefully together and share stories. A species that celebrated individual existence and turned survival into an art form. A species that might just change the entire galaxy one meal at a time. The Blood Fang undocked from the human vessel, but for the first time in her career, Zarath felt reluctant to leave a potential combat situation. Because despite every tactical instinct she possessed, this hadn't been a combat situation at all. It had been something far more dangerous to the established order of the galaxy. It had been hope. 3 months after the feast, the galaxy had become a very different place. Ambassador Kethvar of the Galactic Council stood before the emergency session, his tentacles writhing with barely controlled frustration. The holographic display behind him showed shipping routes, trade agreements, and territorial maps that had been stable for centuries. Now, red warning indicators flashed across nearly every sector. "Honorable counselors," he began, his translator struggling with the emotional undertones in his voice. "We face an unprecedented crisis. The humans have been in our galaxy for less than a year, and they have already destabilized every major political alliance in the Outer Rim territories." Murmurs rippled through the assembled delegates. Representatives from 12 different species, each representing vast stellar empires that had maintained balance through careful diplomacy and strategic deterrence, all looking at the same impossible data. "The Veltar hunting packs have signed non-aggression pacts with 3 former enemy species," Kethvar continued. "The Thoraxian swarm has established trade routes with the Krillian Empire. The Nethys Shadow Confederation has agreed to mediation talks with 6 different territorial rivals. These are species that have been at war for millennia." Council Speaker Mordun, representing the oldest civilization in the known galaxy, leaned forward. "And all of these changes began after this feast?" "Precisely. What the humans call Thanksgiving appears to have triggered a cascade of diplomatic realignments that we are still struggling to understand." The truth was even more complex than Kethvar was willing to admit publicly. In the 3 months since Captain Chen had invited 17 apex predator species to dinner, the humans had received over 400 requests for similar cultural exchanges. Species that had never initiated first contact with anyone were sending delegations to the human colony ship. The Wanderer had become the unofficial diplomatic center of the Outer Rim territories. "What exactly do we know about these humans?" asked Counselor Zixara, her crystalline form refracting light in agitated patterns. Kethvar activated a new display. "More than we initially gathered, unfortunately. Their species' history suggests they have been practicing cultural assimilation for thousands of years. They call it hospitality, but the strategic implications are clear. They identify powerful local groups, invite them to social gatherings, and somehow convert potential threats into allies. Through food?" Speaker Mordun's voice carried disbelief. "Through food, cultural exchange, and something they call making friends. The psychological impact appears to be remarkably effective. Species that have never shown interest in cooperation are now actively seeking human mediation in territorial disputes." What Kethvar didn't mention was that the Council's own intelligence networks had been compromised. 3 different espionage organizations had reported that their agents, sent to monitor human activities, had been invited to something called Game Night, and had subsequently filed reports recommending formal diplomatic contact with the human colony. The humans weren't just making friends with apex predators, they were making friends with everyone they encountered, including professional spies whose job was to remain emotionally detached. "Counselors," Kethvar said carefully, "we may be dealing with the most sophisticated psychological warfare campaign in galactic history, one that disguises itself as innocent social interaction." At that moment, alarms began sounding throughout the council chambers. The emergency communication system activated, displaying the face of Fleet Admiral Korkseth from the Outer Rim Patrol. "Council, we have a situation developing in the Nexus sector. 3 major fleets are converging on a single point, and our intelligence suggests they're heading toward the human vessel." Speaker Mordun's expression darkened. Are we looking at the first military confrontation? No, sir, the Admiral replied, his voice carrying confusion. They appear to be heading there for something called a potluck dinner. The council chamber fell silent. Meanwhile, aboard the Wanderer, Captain Sarah Chen was dealing with what she privately considered the most complex logistical challenge of her career. The ship's Great Hall had been expanded twice, but it still couldn't accommodate the growing number of species requesting invitations to what had become a regular weekly gathering. Captain, Lieutenant Rodriguez reported, checking his tablet. We have confirmation from 43 different species for this week's dinner. The Zephyrian cloud dancers are bringing something they call sky bread. The metallic collective is synthesizing what they hope will be compatible with organic digestive systems. And the hive mind of Altair wants to know if we have any objections to telepathically shared desserts. Chen rubbed her temples. 3 months ago, she had been worried about finding a suitable planet for colonization. Now she was accidentally running the most successful diplomatic mission in galactic history. Any word from the Galactic Council? She asked. They've requested a formal meeting to discuss our cultural activities. I think they're starting to get nervous about all the peace breaking out. Chen smiled. It was a perfectly reasonable concern from their perspective. The Galactic Council had maintained stability for thousands of years through careful balance of power. When species that had been fighting for millennia suddenly started cooperating, it made the old power structures obsolete. Schedule the meeting, she decided, but invite them for dinner first. Can't have a proper diplomatic discussion on an empty stomach. The transformation hadn't been limited to formal diplomatic relationships. Individual beings who had attended the feast were changing their own behaviors in ways that rippled throughout their societies. Captain Zarath of the Veltar had returned to her home world with recipes and a request that had shocked the Hunting Council. She wanted to establish what she called a cultural exchange program with other species. The idea of Veltar warriors learning about art, music, and cuisine instead of combat techniques was so unprecedented that it required 3 councils and a formal vote to approve. But approve it they did, largely because Zarath's pack had somehow managed to negotiate mining rights to 3 asteroid fields that had been disputed territory for centuries. The other species involved had agreed to arbitration instead of warfare, with the condition that the negotiations be held over dinner. Similar changes were happening throughout the region. The Thoraxian swarm had begun producing what they called celebration honey for trade instead of exclusively focusing on military bioweapons. The Krillian Empire had established its first cultural ministry in recorded history. The Nethys Shadow Confederation had begun hosting what they called twilight gatherings, where different species could meet and share stories. Each change seemed small, but together they represented a fundamental shift in how these civilizations viewed themselves and their neighbors. The most dramatic change was happening on the Wanderer itself. What had started as a colony ship seeking a new home had transformed into something unprecedented in galactic history. A neutral meeting ground where any species could come to resolve disputes, establish trade relationships, or simply learn about their neighbors. The humans had accidentally created the galaxy's first truly international space station, powered entirely by the simple concept of shared meals. Captain Chen, Communications Officer Park called from her station. We're receiving a priority transmission from the Veltar vessel Bloodfang. The main screen activated, showing Captain Zarath's familiar features. But something was different. The Veltar warrior looked relaxed, wasn't the right word. Content, perhaps. Captain Chen, Zarath said. I hope you're well. I'm calling to inform you of an unprecedented development. What's happened? The Veltar Hunting Council has voted to invite you and a delegation of humans to our home world. We would like to host what we're calling our first Feast of Understanding. Zarath paused, then added with something that might have been humor. We've been practicing with the recipes you shared. I believe we're ready to return your hospitality." Chen felt a surge of pride and excitement. The Veltar were among the most insular species in the galaxy. An invitation to their home world was almost unheard of for outsiders. "We would be honored to attend," she replied. "What can we bring to contribute to the feast?" "Just yourselves," Zarath said, "and perhaps some of that chocolate birthday cake your young friend mentioned. We've become curious about this custom of celebrating individual existence." After the transmission ended, Chen stood looking out at the stars through the observation deck windows. In the distance, she could see the running lights of dozens of ships from different species, all converging on the Wanderer for the weekly dinner gathering. 3 months ago, these same ships would have been firing on each other. Now they were coming together to share food and stories. Lieutenant Rodriguez joined her at the window. "Captain, do you think we've changed the galaxy?" Chen considered the question carefully. Below them, in the Great Hall, a Thoraxian war leader was teaching human children how to weave silk patterns while learning about something called finger painting. A group of Nethys shadow stalkers were engaged in a heated discussion about musical theory with the ship's jazz ensemble. 3 different species were working together to plan next week's menu. "I don't think we changed the galaxy, Lieutenant," she said finally. "I think we reminded it of something it had forgotten, which is that the thing that makes us strongest isn't the ability to destroy our enemies. It's the ability to turn our enemies into friends." The weekly dinner began, as it always did, with Captain Chen standing before the assembled beings and asking for a moment of gratitude. But this time, instead of 30 seconds of silence, something unprecedented happened. One by one, representatives from different species stood and spoke about what they were grateful for. The Veltar captain talked about learning that strength could be expressed through protection rather than aggression. The Thoraxian hive mind expressed gratitude for discovering individual identity within collective existence. The Krillian war leader gave thanks for understanding that victory could be achieved without defeating anyone. As the expressions of gratitude continued, Chen realized they were witnessing the birth of something new. Not just an alliance or a treaty, but a fundamental shift in how diverse species could coexist. They were creating a template for galactic civilization that had never existed before. When the formal expressions of gratitude ended, the feast began. But this time, it wasn't just humans serving food to their guests. Every species had contributed dishes from their own cultures, creating a truly galactic banquet that represented hundreds of different worlds and thousands of years of culinary evolution. As the evening progressed, Chen found herself in conversation with war leader Thaxmore, who had become one of their most regular attendees. "Captain," he said, sampling something called fusion cuisine that had been created by collaboration between 4 different species, "I have been thinking about your words from our first meeting." "Which words?" "You said that the strongest armies are built on loyalty, not fear. The most secure nations have the most friends, not the biggest weapons." He paused, gesturing around the hall where former enemies were sharing recipes and planning joint cultural events. "I believe you may have proven your point." Chen smiled. "War leader, I think we've all proven something more important than military doctrine. Which is? That the galaxy is big enough for everyone to have a place at the table." Months later, when galactic historians tried to identify the moment that changed everything, they would point to different events. Some would cite the first non-aggression pact signed between former enemies. Others would point to the establishment of the first interspecies cultural exchange programs. A few would identify the moment when the Galactic Council formally recognized the humans as mediators rather than newcomers. But Captain Sarah Chen always knew the real turning point had been much simpler. It had been the moment when a human child asked a Veltar warrior about her favorite flavor. and the warrior had discovered she wanted to try chocolate, because that was when a predator had become a friend, and when friendship had become the most powerful force in the galaxy. The Wanderer continued its journey through space, no longer a colony ship seeking a new home, but a floating embassy that carried the radical message that the universe was improved when diverse beings chose to share their tables instead of their battlefields. And in the Great Hall, every week, hundreds of different beings gathered to prove that the most revolutionary act in the galaxy was simply treating strangers like family. It was, after all, what humans did best.